Hi everyone and welcome to the next part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote: unlike other games in which lucre is the end and aim, chess recommends itself to the wise by the fact that its mimic battles are fought for no prize but honor. It is eminently and emphatically the philosopher's game, coming from one of the all-time chess greats, Paul Morphy. Now, a review of the last part where we completed the third chapter, the 7th and 8th ranks, after discussing the remaining 3 of 5 special cases in the 7th rank with examples, and also went through 2 endgame illustrations given by Nimzowitsch. So now, moving further into the book, we begin chapter 4, the passed pawn, which is a relatively longer chapter thus far into the book. Nimzowitsch starts the chapter with the following first heading: Endgame or Middle Game. To get our bearings, the neighbor who is somewhat disturbing and the vis-a-vis or counterpart who is wholly unpleasant, the pawn majority, the candidate, the birth of a passed pawn, rules for candidate. Nimzowitsch gives the definition of a passed pawn and writes: a pawn is passed if that pawn has nothing to fear from an enemy pawn in front of him, that is, in the same file or from one on a neighboring file, and whose road to queen is therefore open. If a pawn is only checked in his advance, that is, blockaded by enemy pieces, the fact does not prejudice or change our conception. An especial recognition is due to a pawn from the fact that enemy pieces must sacrifice a part of their effective strength in order to keep a pawn under observation, and in fact under continual observation. If further we bear in mind that the pawn enjoys another advantage over the pieces in that a pawn is the born defender, we shall slowly discover that even on the 64 squares, the pawn or foot soldier is worthy of all respect. Who checks an ambitious enemy pawn best? A pawn. Who protects one of his own pieces best? A pawn. And which of the chessmen works for least wages? Again, the pawn. For a steady job such as protecting one of his own fellows or keeping in restraint one of the enemy's men does not appeal to a piece at all. Moreover, such occupation draws off troops from the active army. When a pawn is so employed, this last applies in very much less measure. Nimzowitsch gives an illustration with the skeleton positioned on board here, where the white A pawn and E pawn and the black D pawn are passed. The white E pawn is passed but blockaded by the knight. Nimzowitsch writes, in the position on board, neither the white B pawn nor the G pawn is free. Yet the former or B pawn seems to be less hampered than the latter, for the B pawn has at any rate no direct antagonist or opponent. The vis-a-vis or counterpart might be compared to an enemy, while the pawn in the next file reminds us rather of a kindly neighbor who, as we know, can have his drawbacks. If, for instance, we are rushing downstairs to keep an important engagement and a neighbor suddenly buttonholes or detains us and involves us in a long talk, ranging from the weather and politics to the high cost of beer, he keeps us from our job. Just as in the position on board, the black c pawn may be a vexation to white's b pawn. Nevertheless, a somewhat gossipy chatterbox of a neighbor is far from being a bitter enemy. Or to apply the simile or analogy to our case, an annoying pawn on a neighboring file is far from being an antagonist. In our position, the white g-pawn's aspirations to greater things can never be satisfied, whereas the c-pawn can always dream of an advance. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses regarding a pawn majority on one side or the other. He explains this through an illustration with the standard opening position on board. Nimzowitsch writes, "Let us now turn to the passed pawns family. In this connection, we must first consider the question of the majority on one side or the other. At the beginning of the game, after the first exchange of pawns in the center, example after e4, e5, d4, e takes on d4 and queen takes on d4, pawn majorities loom up. White has now 4 to 3 on the king side. Black has 4 to 3 on the queen side. Let us imagine the black d-pawn standing at d6 for the purpose of curbing the ambitions of white's e-pawn. The skeleton position of pawns will be as displayed on board. In the course of the game, if black can arrive at f5, thus killing white's free center pawn, the majority for white on the king side will be in yet clearer evidence, namely white's pawns f2, g2, h2 as against black's pawns at g7 and h7. Nimzowitsch gives a rule here regarding a pawn majority and explains it through the help of a diagram where we have this position on board. He writes, "Rule: every healthy, uncompromised pawn majority must be able to yield a passed pawn. Of the 3 pawns on the king side in the position on board, the f pawn is the only one to have no opponents. This pawn is therefore the least trammeled or deprived, and accordingly has the greatest claim to become free or passed. This pawn is therefore the legitimate candidate. Put more precisely, the rule takes the following shape. The spearhead of the advance is furnished by the candidate. The other pawns are only to be regarded as supports. So f4, f5, then g4, g5 and f6. If black pawns are at g6 and h5, then white must play f4, g3 and not at once h3 because of h4, and white's majority is crippled. So f4, g3, h3, g4 and f5. How simple and yet how often we see weak players in this position advancing first with the g pawn, to which black replies with g5, and white's majority is worthless. I have often racked my brain to discover why less experienced players begin with g4. Yet the matter bears a simple explanation. The players in question are in two minds whether to begin on the right h4 or to the left f4, and in their perplexity decide after good respectable custom to choose the golden mean. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses about the blockade of passed pawns with the following second heading: the blockade of passed pawns, proof of the obligation to blockade, and why the said proof must be of the greatest importance to the practical player as well as to the theoretician, chess philosopher. The exceedingly complicated because ever varying relations between the passed pawn and the blockader on strong and weak, elastic and inelastic blockaders. He explains this through the help of another diagram where we have this skeleton position on board. Nimzowitsch writes, in the position shown on board, black has a passed pawn, which can however be blockaded by knight d4 or bishop d4. By blockade, we mean the mechanical stopping of an enemy pawn's advance by a piece, which is brought about by placing our piece directly in front of the pawn to be blockaded. Here and in all similar cases, the question comes up: does not this blockade connote or imply an unnecessary expenditure of energy? Would it not suffice to keep the pawn under observation here by the knight or bishop bearing upon d4? Is keeping up a blockade work worthy of an officer? Will not the officer's mobility, so long as they take their blockading problem seriously, be to a considerable extent diminished? Is the piece not thus degraded to the status of a stopped, immobile pawn? In a nutshell, is the blockade economical? I am glad to be able to offer you, as I think, an exhaustive solution to this problem. The mediocre critic would settle the question by laying down quite briefly the general thesis that pawns must be stopped, but in my eyes this were a proof of poverty of understanding. The why and the wherefore are of extraordinary importance. There are three reasons which logically make the blockade imperative or crucial. In what follows, these will be analyzed accordingly, and the effective strength of the blockader will be assessed in detail. First reason: the passed pawn is a criminal who should be kept under lock and key. Mild measures such as police surveillance are not sufficient. The passed pawn's lust to expand, the awakening of the men or pieces in the rear. We return again to the position on board. The black forces, bishop, rook, and knight, are, as we would say, grouped round the passed pawn. That is to say, they conform to a complex of which the d pawn is the nucleus. Knight and bishop guard the passed pawn. The rook, however, supplies the pawn with a certain impetus, gives the pawn a supporting impulse. In fact, so powerful is the pawn's desire to press on here, to expand, of which fact indeed visible recognition is given in the way the officers, laying aside all pride of caste, picturesquely group themselves round this simple foot soldier. That our d-pawn often seems ready to advance on their own account, when to do so will cost the pawn's life. So for instance, d4, knight takes on d4 or bishop takes on d4. And now all of a sudden the black forces in the rear come to life. The bishop from b7 commands a diagonal bearing on the enemy king. The rook has a clear file, while the knight has a new square in the center. Such an advance at the cost of self-immolation or setting fire to oneself for the purpose of opening a file is as a rule only characteristic of a pawn roller, a compact advancing mass of pawns in the center, and therefore furnishes a brilliant proof of the lust to expand inherent in a passed pawn. For the mobile center, the pawn roller is endowed with an almost incredible energy. Again, the clearing of a square for one of their own knights is a very special characteristic of an advance of this kind. Accordingly, we say that the first consideration, which logically compels the blockade, is that the free passed pawn is such a dangerous criminal that it is by no means sufficient to keep him under police supervision by the knight at b3 and the bishop at f2 in the position on board. The fellow must be put in prison, so we take away the pawn's freedom utterly by blockading the pawn with the knight at d4. Nimzowitsch further elaborates with a diagram where we have this position on a board from a game between Jan-Willem T. Kolste versus Aron Nimzowitsch played in 1925 in the Baden-Baden tournament at Baden-Baden, Germany. Jan-Willem T. Kolste was a Dutch chess master and won the Dutch championship at Utrecht, Netherlands, his birth city, in 1907. Nimzowitsch writes, the example just considered, we mean the sacrifice of the pawn, for the pawn intended to die in the advance, is thoroughly typical, although it is not in the least necessary that a whole host of pieces to the rear should be freed by the operation. It is often but a single piece standing behind it that profits. Take the position on board. Black, whose queenside and center seem to be threatened, seeks to turn his candidate to account. Since the candidate is 90% a passed pawn, the same rules apply for this pawn as do for a passed pawn. Accordingly, f4, g takes on f4, g4, bishop g2 and knight f5. That is sacrifice of a candidate, with the result that the square f5 is cleared for the knight on h6. The continuation was queen b3, d takes on c4, queen takes on c4 check, king h8, queen c3, h5, rook d1, rook d3, h4, rook d3, knight d5, queen d2 and rook g8. Black supports his pawn majority with vigor. Bishop takes on d5, c takes on d5, king h1, g3, and black gets the attack. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system here, and we shall continue onwards from the next one. Shout out to walkerboy for continuing his subscription and gifting 4 subscriptions to viewers on my Twitch stream last week. Fellow Twitch streamer Skwerly with 3 gifted subscriptions. RockyMtnChess for continuing his subscription and 1 gifted subscription. Parmenides1 with a subscription. Olipals and fortunachesscoach with continued subscriptions. Jacob Fortuna is a strong player with a USCF rating of almost 2000 and a fellow streamer with a very nice stream of his own where he enjoys teaching others how to improve in chess. I will post a link to it in the video description. Do check him out. An anonymous user or users with 3 gifted subscriptions. Purely the top chairer with a jaw-dropping 10,500 bits. Thank you for that, Derek. And again, if you haven't checked out his street chess stream as of yet, then you are missing on something awesome. The link to Derek's stream is in the video description. Empty wave function at 2nd with 2000 bits, Karma Dumpster at 3rd with 1000 bits, OK Tested at 4th with 210 bits. OK Tested is Abhinay Verma, a good player from India. Jacob G99 at 5th with 201 bits. Jacob has improved quite a lot with his game and also started streaming recently. A link to his stream will be available in the video description as well. I do recommend checking him out. He has a fun personality and is an interactive streamer as well. RockyMtnChess at 6th with 200 bits and olipals and Simon Twitch at 7th with 100 bits each last week. And then anonymous support with 1591 bits last week as well. Thank you for the amazing support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.